Welcome back. You are listening to Today I Learned Bitcoin. This is the host, Alec. Today, we're actually going to learn about UTXOs. If you don't know what an UTXO is and you hold Bitcoin, this is the episode for you, especially if you plan to hold Bitcoin for the long term. We're going to discuss quite a few different arrays, like what UTXO management means and what the implications are if you're holding just small amounts of Bitcoin and UTXOs, what could happen potentially in the future, making sure you're aware, of the long term and, just really how to control your coins in the most efficient way. To learn about this, I actually brought back our guest from a few episodes back, Tom Honzik. He's actually a subject matter expert surrounding UTXOs, so I figured who better to ask? It's been a incredibly important topic lately. If you're on Bitcoin Twitter or around the space in general, there's been tons of talk, especially with the recent spike in fees on the Bitcoin main chain. So incredibly important subject to learn. Excited to dive into this. Let me go ahead and bring up Tom and we'll get things rolling here. Tom, welcome back, man. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Alec. Yeah, thanks for having me back on. This is my first repeat appearance on a podcast, and happy to be here for sure.
Awesome. Well, I truly appreciate you taking the time. I'm excited to dive into this. I'll admit, I've never once went through to manage my UTXOs. I knew that there was some things I should be aware of, try to, not do small transactions through my DCA and whatnot, kind of set a threshold, but never really took it seriously until recently, reading articles like yours and honestly, like a ton of the people I follow on Twitter have been posting about it recently. So figured what a better time. So thank you for coming on to walk through that.
Yeah, my pleasure. UTXOs, you're not alone in the crowd of Bitcoiners that don't manage UTXOs yet or don't even know what a UTXO is. It sounds like a technical term, but it's really not that scary, and I'm sure we're going to get into that here in a minute.
Yeah, man. Why don't we start with, for anyone that's unfamiliar, what is a UTXO? Like, what does that stand for?
Yeah, so UTXO is an acronym. It stands for Unspent Transaction Output. So the TX in the middle there is kind of for transaction. And when people hear that unspent transaction output, that sounds extremely technical. So that doesn't really shed much light on what it actually is. But basically, anytime a transaction occurs, you've got inputs and you've got outputs. So you've got people sending Bitcoin and you've got people receiving Bitcoin. So the people that are receiving Bitcoin, what they receive are the outputs. And so they're receiving UTXOs. The unspent part just means that it's a chunk of Bitcoin that has been received, but it's not been sent again. So it's still at the same address that received it. So in other words, if I sent you some Bitcoin right now, just with a normal Bitcoin transaction, you would receive a UTXO worth the amount that I'm sending you. And the reason why this is important is because all Bitcoin exists as UTXOs, and you can have a wallet full of Bitcoin, and you can have the same amount of Bitcoin in different numbers of UTXOs. So for example, I could have maybe a wallet with one Bitcoin in it, and it could just be one UTXO inside that wallet. And that's because I received only one deposit worth that amount. But also, I could have a wallet with one Bitcoin in it, but I received that Bitcoin in several transactions. So I was receiving maybe a quarter of a Bitcoin and then a half of a Bitcoin and then a few more smaller chunks that add up to one. Now my wallet, it still has one Bitcoin total, but it actually has several UTXOs in it worth these different amounts. So again, you can think of a UTXO as like a chunk of Bitcoin, basically.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Someone gave me a really cool analogy once on UTXOs. It was kind of like, you have the average person has used cash before in their life, right? Like you can have $100 bill or you can have 100 $1 bills, or, you know, 5 $20 bills. And that's kind of the same concept. Like a UTXO is almost like a bill of a certain value, right? But all those together are comprised of the total money you have, the $100, right? Is that, in your opinion, pretty good analogy?
Yeah, I love that one. So you can almost think of a Bitcoin wallet like a piggy bank. And then when you're receiving deposits, you're getting UTXOs. You can think of that as like dollar bills worth specific amounts that are landing in your piggy bank. Now, UTXOs can be any amount though, right? Dollars, they're kind of limited to like denominations of $1, $5, 20, etc. But with UTXOs, they can be any amount. And that's different than like the bank account model, right? If you have a bank account and you receive, 20 deposits that add up to $1,000, that's no different than just receiving one deposit worth $1,000. There's no implications between the two and any differences. But with dollar bills in a piggy bank, as well as with UTXOs for Bitcoin, it does matter. If you think about having a $100 bill in your piggy bank versus 100 $1 bills, you have different choices to make when you go to take some money out, maybe to buy something, right? If you only have a $100 bill, you're going to give it to someone. If you're buying $20 worth of goods, they need to give you change of like $80. Or you could give them a wad of 20 different $1 bills. And so there is differences there.
Yeah, totally. Definitely makes sense. I mean, for the average person that's, most people are just stacking Bitcoin, it's a scarce asset, they just want to hold it for the long term. Like, in your mind, who needs to be aware of like understanding a UTXO, all the things about it, and like why is it so important to understand these things?
Yeah, great question. So for someone that has just bought Bitcoin, but they haven't taken self-custody of the Bitcoin yet, which, if anyone's in that position, you definitely should prioritize that for reasons we talked about in our last episode together. But so yeah, if someone else is holding on to your Bitcoin for you, if you're using a custodian, which is a dangerous idea, then UTXOs don't matter to you. Okay. But once you do take that very important step to hold your own keys to the Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin is now in your self custody, now UTXOs start to matter a bit more. Now, they are a little bit technical and intimidating to someone who's brand new to Bitcoin. And so I don't really consider UTXOs to be a like beginner level necessity, right? Your focus, probably if you're brand new, should just be stacking up Bitcoin and moving it to self custody. And then you can learn about UTXOs a little later as sort of an intermediate level, lesson. So but it is something that people should graduate into, because once you learn about UTXOs, you do have a lot more control over your money, because UTXOs can affect how much transaction fees that you have to pay, and they can also have some privacy implications as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of in that position, right? I've been using and holding and buying Bitcoin for a couple of years now, and I understood what a UTXO was, but I never really grasped why it mattered, what the future implications are, until people like yourself, started writing articles and posting about, what happens 10, maybe 20, or, it could be even shorter, but like 10 years from now, when there's a much higher demand for Bitcoin. And, a lot of this conversation, I feel, was sparked from the whole like ordinals, inscriptions things, JPEGs on the blockchain, causing the fees to go, pretty parabolic. We saw these really big fee spikes recently, and we've seen some in the past, right? But that's kind of what was fresh on everyone's mind, and prompted that conversation again. So that's what kind of drove me to want to learn about this. And luckily there's people like yourself they're out here educating and writing articles about it. So like, you wrote an article about how to prevent UTXOs, small ones, from becoming essentially dust, right? So Could you, give us a little walkthrough, like what's the necessity to understand this? Like what is this dust? Does this just mean my Bitcoin's worthless, or what's like the purpose behind that article?
Yeah. The Dust article was my most recent one, and that was a really fun one to write. So, like I said a minute ago, UTXOs, they kind of have two different implications for Bitcoin holders. One is on transaction fees, the other is privacy. The privacy stuff I think is a bit more advanced, and so we can push that to the side and maybe come back to that later, perhaps. But yeah, the transaction fee side is definitely what people want to be learning about first, I would say. And the dust aspect, I do want to get to that, but first it's important for people to understand how transaction fees are calculated in Bitcoin. I think you did an episode towards the beginning of this podcast about the mempool, which is a great dashboard for looking at transaction fees and stuff, what people are paying to move their Bitcoin. But it all boils down to a very simple calculation for when you need to move your Bitcoin, how much you're going to have to pay. It's going to be the amount of data that your transaction is using. So that's measured in bytes. And then also the fee rate that you're choosing. And the fee rate is going to be sats per byte. Okay, so if you have, 100 bytes of data and you're paying 1 sat per byte, then your transaction is going to cost 100 sats, right? That's maybe not a realistic example, but that's just to demonstrate the equation there. And so those two components, the data and the fee rate, let's dive into both of those. They're both really important. So the data that your transaction uses, that is dependent on a few factors, but one of the main ones is going to be how many UTXOs you're moving. All right, so we talked about how you can have a wallet with just one UTXO, all of your Bitcoins in that one UTXO, or you could have a wallet where your Bitcoin is spread across many UTXOs. Now, if you want to spend, the majority of your Bitcoin out of your wallet or move it somewhere, the number of UTXOs contributes to the data, and that contributes to the cost to move the Bitcoin, right? And also, I should note that at no point in that equation is the amount of Bitcoin relevant, right? So you could move $100 worth of Bitcoin, or you could move $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, and that doesn't matter for how much fees you're paying. It only matters, again, the data and the fee rate. So the data part is pretty simple. Again, it's kind of how many UTXOs you have. Then the fee rate is something you get to choose. So you could choose a low fee rate, you could choose a high fee rate. You're generally going to choose something based on what other people are choosing at the time. What is the demand to move Bitcoin like? So if demand is high, you might have to pay a higher fee rate to get your Bitcoin moved quickly. If demand is low, you might not. It also depends on your personal urgency to move the Bitcoin. Okay. And so once you have the fee rate chosen and you have the amount of data, then you know how much you're going to pay. Now, there are small UTXOs that you could have where they are a set amount of data, and the minimum fee rate that you can pay is going to be 1 satoshi per byte. So if you have a UTXO that's worth a very tiny amount, like 250 satoshis or something, then it could cost you more than that UTXO is worth in order to move it. And so that's going back to your question about dust. That's loosely what dust means. It's Bitcoin. It's a chunk of Bitcoin that costs more to move it than it's worth. And so, why would you ever spend more money to unlock a less amount of money? It's basically worthless to you at that point.
Gotcha. Okay, couple questions for you. So what you just said about dust, like to give an example, if I were to do like a credit card payment for 30 cents. Like most credit card companies charge like a 30-cent per transaction fee. So to the merchant, that's just dust, right? So that's probably a pretty good comparison, and why a lot of people don't like to do tiny credit card transactions. And second, you mentioned that, the amount of Bitcoin doesn't determine the size. So I could have, 1 Bitcoin or 1,000 within a UTXO. What is it that's determining the size of a UTXO?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So most UTXOs are going to be about the same amount of data, but the variances really depend on what's called the script or the address type. And that gets a bit technical, but basically you can think of it as single signature is going to be less data than multi-signature. That might change in the near future, but that's how it's been. And then also, like, if anyone has heard of SegWit before, which is a famous soft fork, there were like address types that were pre-SegWit and address types that were post-SegWit, and post-SegWit address types are going to be less data. So that was a helpful upgrade for people to save on fees. And also, historically, if you use multi-sig, the quorum size matters. So if you have a kind of a simple multi-sig quorum, like a 2 of 3, that's going to be cheaper than 3 of 5, or larger numbers.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And then if I, obviously want to put like a monkey in on there, that's going to increase the size, and I'm going to spend more in fees. Is that kind of the idea if you're like putting data in there as well?
Yeah, I haven't messed with that too much myself, but with taproot addresses, that's where these inscription stuff are happening. And I think that data is discounted. It's using the SegWit discount, but yeah, it certainly does add data. It does add cost. I wish I knew more about that, but that's about the extent of my knowledge on that.
I mean, I don't find it personally too interesting, so
Right.
I don't blame you for not doing your research there. They can do whatever they want, but I guess it just helps understand like why fees are going up with demand. And just I thought it was cool looking at the mempool and just seeing like what people were spending on some of these transactions, because it seemed quite outrageous. Like a very small amount of Bitcoin they're paying a large fee for. Obviously it doesn't make monetary sense. So, they were doing it for different purposes, logging that on the blockchain, whatever the data was, a picture, things like that, right? So it's kind of an interesting aspect. But I guess so what should we do with this information, right? We know that in the future, as demand increases, people are trying to send more transactions on the blockchain. They want them to go through quickly. That means people are willing to pay more. What does that mean for me as someone that just kind of stacks Bitcoin right now, but I hope to be able to spend it for products or services that I want in the future, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because up to this point it's like, yeah, this is interesting, but what do I do with this? And if you want to limit your transaction fees that you have to pay and you want to avoid dust, there's some strategies that you can use now while you're stacking Bitcoin to make your life easier down the road. So again, looking purely from a fee standpoint, um, you want to limit the amount of UTXOs you are holding. So you do that by receiving fewer deposits to your wallet. So if you are buying Bitcoin on an exchange and then you're sending that Bitcoin to your wallet that you hold the keys to, your self-custody, if you do that once per day, right? You buy Bitcoin every day and then you immediately move it into your wallet, you're going to get a new UTXO in your wallet every day. And you're going to, over the course of a month, you're going to have 30 UTXOs. And now you're setting yourself up for higher fees down the road, especially if you have to move your Bitcoin during a high fee rate environment. So people should consider an alternative of maybe let the Bitcoin build up a little bit on the exchange before you move it to self-custody, so you can move it with less frequency. There is a trade-off there that you're keeping a little bit more of your Bitcoin in someone else's custody for that amount of time, but hopefully that's a relatively small percentage of your total Bitcoin. And so if you do it, if you move Bitcoin off the exchange maybe 2 or 3 times a month, then you're going to be building up those UTXOs at a much slower rate, and that's going to be good for your fees. And then also, you want to be careful with the sizing that you're doing as well. So you don't want to hold UTXOs that are super tiny, because if fee rates go up and they stay elevated, then effectively some of those UTXOs that you're holding that are really small, they could become operative dust. So if you needed to move it quickly, you're going to be paying more in fees than what it's worth. So a rule of thumb that some people have been talking about lately is try not to hold too many UTXOs that are less than 1 million satoshis. And 1 million sats right now costs like $300 or so. So if you're letting Bitcoin get up to that amount on the exchange before you move it into self-custody, that's probably a good thing. It also means, though, that as we go into the future, if Bitcoin becomes more valuable, it could be harder to afford 1 million satoshis. So we could be facing kind of a problem there in coming years. And before I forget, I also want to mention that if you're someone that does have a lot of UTXOs, there is something you can do about that. So if you're someone that has been moving Bitcoin off the exchange into self-custody like a few times a week, and you might have built up all these UTXOs, you can consolidate them. You can do a UTXO consolidation. It's a very simple process. You just grab a bunch of UTXOs that you're holding, you send them back to yourself, back to your wallet, and the result is that you've basically combined them into one UTXO. So you could go from 30 down to 1 quite easily. You're going to have to pay some transaction fees to do that, but if you perform that consolidation when fee rates are relatively low, then you will be saving money, if you ever had to move your Bitcoin when fee rates are much higher. So I know I kind of rambled there for a bit, but hopefully that made sense.
No, yeah, 100%. I think you covered all the bases there, but like one thing that I, always had a question mark about prior to this conversation, and like diving deeper into your article, was like, everyone says just consolidate your UTXOs. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, simple enough. You're just sending a transaction to yourself. But I think it's important to know, like, not every wallet software allows you to do something like that, right? You have to have one that specifically allows for coin control, so you can actually see each individual UTXO, select those small ones that you want to consolidate, put that in a send address, and then obviously paste your receive within the same wallet. Is that all accurate?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because a lot of Bitcoin wallets, they don't show you anything about your UTXOs. They do that on purpose, actually, because a lot of people that are new, they don't want to be overwhelmed with that kind of technical information, and they don't want to have to think about that. That's going to scare them away from Bitcoin. So yeah, a lot of introductory level wallets and stuff that people are used to might not be able to see the details, but luckily Bitcoin wallets, you can generally take the underlying information and you can load it into a different wallet software, a different interface that does allow you to see the full details of the UTXOs that you're holding and what they're worth. And then when you go to spend, you can actually manually select which ones you want to spend. And that's actually good for privacy as well. But if you don't manually select it and you go to send Bitcoin, then there's just going to be some sort of algorithm that chooses for you which UTXOs you're spending. If someone's on like a desktop and they want to know an example of a wallet that lets you see UTXOs and lets you control them, Sparrow Wallet is a really popular one that's has a good interface. It has a lot of cool tools. Also, Unchained has built a browser-based open source wallet as well, which is called Caravan, and people can control UTXOs on that as well.
Cool. Yeah, honestly, I wasn't sure if mine did. I use a Trezor. I've had it for a few years now, and I'm not someone that sends a lot of Bitcoin. Usually, I use like a software wallet if I'm spending or transacting in general. Either a software wallet that does Lightning or some do base chain. But yeah, it was cool to know. I had logged in my Trezor suite, and there it was, coin control when I go to hit send, so I can actually go through my list. And I was actually kind of blown away. I didn't realize how many UTXOs I had in there. So after this conversation, I'm definitely going to go through and do a consolidation. Is there like, so there's that kind of thought of rule, like nothing less than zero point zero 0.01 or a million satoshis, right? Is that something that's based on like a price number, or do you have any like background on why or where that number comes from?
Yeah, and I would say it's definitely just a very rough estimate rule of thumb. I don't think people need to, be worried if they have a few UTXOs that are less than a million sats. I would say it's important not to keep like the bulk of your Bitcoin amongst UTXOs that are less than a million sats. But if you have a few of your UTXOs are on the smaller side, then the majority of your Bitcoin is still protected from really high fees. But yeah, the the million sat number that comes from calculating, what the average amount of data is to move a particular UTXO, and then kind of speculation on how high could fee rates get in the future. So, throughout 2022, fee rates were very low. It was very often just 1 sat per byte that you could pay to move your Bitcoin quickly. But there are periods of much higher demand that can be sustained for weeks or months. In early 2021, when we had, some of the top of the bull market, there was a lot of excitement there. A lot of Bitcoin was flying around, and you did have sustained periods of higher fees. And then we saw that again, just like, not that long ago in 2023 with the demand for, the inscription stuff and all that. So, yeah, we don't really know what the fee rates are going to look like in the future. That's just something that needs to be speculated upon. We all expect, since we're Bitcoiners, we all expect Bitcoin will become more and more adopted because it just makes sense. And right now, there's such a small population in the world that's actually, taking it seriously and using it heavily. So the number of people certainly has a lot of room to grow. That could mean that the demand to use the block space on the blockchain is going to go up a lot, and that could drive up fee rates. But there's also some other factors that are going to keep fee rates down a bit. Most people that are into Bitcoin have heard of Lightning, layer twos. That helps people move Bitcoin around without doing a transaction on the blockchain and using up that block space. So that takes some demand away from fees and fee rates. And then also, if fee rates get too high, then there's going to be somewhat of an equilibrium effect pushing it back down, because too many UTXOs are going to start to hit that dust threshold where it doesn't make sense to move them, and then that'll also bring down the demand.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I kind of had two thoughts that came out of that. One, you mentioned like there's a ton of building on kind of like these side chains, layer twos, right? So it's super cool that there's going to be tools, but as those generate as well, like that might generate some more demand for the block space. Whether it's I've learned a lot about Liquid recently, obviously Lightning. If we can do a bulk majority of the transactions off there, fantastic. We still need to move, have a main chain move to get them onto layer two, right? So like going through to understand coin control is, super important in my opinion now, just so if you plan to spend Bitcoin in the future, you know how to do it in an efficient manner, right? You're not is spending 5 UTXOs where you could have just spent one, things like that, right? So I think it's important as you get more comfortable with Bitcoin, if you have a long-term outlook and plan to spend that stuff in the future, some that's going to be super important. But yeah, I mean, super excited about the layer twos that are coming out that will allow for cheaper and faster transactions because I share the opinion that base chain's probably going to have a ton of demand from lots of different projects, large movement of coins, things like that. But just buying a coffee, it's probably going to be done on something like Lightning, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it kind of highlights the need for second layer. Bitcoin only processes a block on average once every 10 minutes. That block can only hold, about a megabyte worth of data. There's some types of data that get a bit of a discount there. But yeah, the reason why Bitcoin is like that is to keep it decentralized. A lot of other crypto stuff has gone the direction of trying to make block time faster. You don't have to wait 10 minutes, or they increase the amount of data that can be held in a block. But then it just becomes harder to run a node and harder to be decentralized. So I think Bitcoin is going to stay the way it is, but we absolutely need effective layer two solutions to onboard the world into this monetary system.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, this has been super educational for me. I want to do like a quick roundup, like the takeaways that everyone should have from this show. For me, you know, understand what a UTXO is. Hopefully, you got that from this. If you don't, Tom's got some great articles on his site. Definitely check him out. I'm going to post, some links in the show notes. Two, understand and check if your wallet has coin control. See if you can see all these UTXOs, what sizes they are, and maybe do a consolidation. Right, if you've got a bunch of UTXOs worth like $20, maybe put some of those together so you have close to 1 million sats in it, right? I guess three, understanding that threshold about 1 million sats is kind of what's speculated upon right now. It may change, so obviously something to keep tabs on and be aware of as demand grows for Bitcoin base chain. And I forgot my last point. Oh yeah, for a super popular, thing that people do is dollar cost average into Bitcoin, right? Like not many people are going out buying a whole coin at a time. They're doing a couple bucks a day or weekly, monthly, things like that, right? So setting a threshold of that withdrawal, whether it's something you have automatic, whether it's something you do manually, maybe every time you smash by $20, probably not super smart to move that into cold storage until it's accumulated close to that, million sat number. Currently sits at $300. That's something I'm comfortable, walking around with in my wallet, maybe leaving on an exchange for, 30 days or so. So to me, those are the biggest takeaways. Did I miss anything, Tom? Anything else that, people should walk away with from listening to this?
Yeah, I'll add on just a couple of quick things, but that is the most important summary. So definitely, if you consider doing a UTXO consolidation, just don't do it just to do it, because it's important that you do try to do it at a low fee rate, because it's really only going to save you money if you do it at a lower fee rate, and then in the future you move your Bitcoin at a higher fee rate. If you do the reverse of that, then you've actually paid more in fees doing the consolidation than you need to. The other thing is that it's a more complicated topic. We didn't get too deep into it in this episode, but there is the privacy side of it. Whenever you consolidate UTXOs, you're sort of linking them together. And if they were previously separated, then you're sort of revealing some information that all of this Bitcoin belongs to the same person. So you do want to keep that in mind if privacy is something that's really important to you. But other than that, yeah, I think the main things right now are just making sure you don't have super tiny UTXOs and you don't have a large number of them either, because that's going to, otherwise you're going to regret that probably down the line.
Yeah, most definitely. And yeah, the privacy stuff super important for those that are, buying non KYC Bitcoin. So if you're familiar with what that is, and you're like buying peer to peer and on an exchange and like housing them in the same wallet, you probably don't want to combine those together if that's was your ultimate goal of buying non KYC in the first place, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, that great point to make. I appreciate it, Tom. Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap this up unless you have anything else that you think super important to cover on the topic.
No, I think this is a great summary for someone who is like brand new to the subject.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you again. Thank you so much for your time, Tom. I've learned a ton. I'm going to dive into my wallet. I'm going to look through some of these UTXOs and see if I can do a consolidation today.
Absolutely. Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me on, Alec.
Awesome, man. Great to talk again, and I'm sure we'll be chatting again soon. Have a good one.